This show is sponsored by Liquid IV. Like many people, I've come into the new year full of hopes and aspirations for the next 12 months. Maybe, like me, you're anxiously pacing the floor waiting for the F1 season to begin, or perhaps you've set yourself a more regular fitness goal, like running your first marathon or commuting to work by bike. Whatever you plan to do in 2025, come into your own way with extraordinary hydration from Liquid IV. Powered by Live Hydroscience, Liquid IV helps you break the mould. Liquid IV is so easy and convenient to tear, pour and enjoy, and it comes in several fantastic flavours, like their new Hydration Multiplier Sugar-Free Raspberry Lemonade, and other winners like White Peach and Rainbow Sherbet. As a regular flyer, I know how easy it is to become dehydrated almost without knowing it when you're travelling. That's why I always take Liquid IV on overseas trips. It's more than just a drink, and it's scientifically formulated to hydrate better than water alone. Just one stick and 16 ounces of water provides 3 times the electrolytes of the leading sports drink, plus 8 essential vitamins and nutrients. And what's more, it's always non-GMO, vegan, gluten-free, dairy-free and soy-free. Embrace your ritual with extraordinary hydration from Liquid IV. Get 20% off your first order of Liquid IV when you go to liquidiv.com and use code THERACE at checkout. That's 20% off your first order when you shop Better Hydration today using promo code THERACE at liquidiv.com.
I'm Dane Brugler. I cover the NFL draft for The Athletic. Our draft guide picked up the name The Beast because of the crazy amount of information that's included. I'm looking at thousands of players, putting together hundreds of scouting reports. I've been covering this year's draft since last year's draft. There is a lot in The Beast that you simply can't find anywhere else. You can get The Beast and all the great coverage my colleagues do by subscribing to The Athletic. You can do that at theathletic.com/subscribe.
The Athletic.
Hello and welcome back to And Colossally, That's History, the podcast that reappraises motor racing history. I'm Richard Williams and I'm joined as ever by my esteemed co-host Matt Bishop. How's it going, Matt?
It's going very well, thank you, Richard. And it's always a delight to chat to you about motor racing, and I'm very much looking forward to digging deeper into the story of Enzo Ferrari today, because this episode is part 2 of our double header on the life and legacy of one of motorsport's most important and enduring individuals. In the previous episode, part 1 of our Enzo Ferrari two-parter, we traced the great man's journey from boyhood racing fan to adult racing driver, then from racing driver to team manager, then from team manager to racing car manufacturer.
That's right, we finished the last episode at the point that Ferrari won its very first World Championship Formula One race, the British Grand Prix at Silverstone in 1951. And in this episode, we'll guide you through the 50s, 60s, 70s and 80s, during which time the idiosyncratic Enzo dealt with triumph and tragedy in almost equal measure, as he and his team cemented their legendary status in the sport. But first, I'm going to invite you to play a little game.
Really?
Yes. I know that this two-parter is about Ferrari the man rather than his machines, but out of all the Ferraris ever built, Matt, if you could have just one to keep for yourself, which would it be?
Well, that is a tough question. So, let me think. Well, if my bank manager or my accountant is listening, he or she nobody knows their bank manager anymore, but I do know my accountant, would want me to say Ferrari 250 GTO, the beautiful GT car powered by the famous 3-litre Colombo V12, of which 36 were built and only 42 are left. That's a joke, by the way. Of which 36 were built between 1962 and 1964. Since I was built in 1962, or born in 1962, I should say, a 1962 GTO would fit the bill very nicely. Thank you, Richard, since you're so kindly offering me one. Trouble is, you're not actually offering me one, are you? Not when one of them, a 1963 car as it happens, which I would settle for, was sold for $70 million a few years ago, 2018 actually.
Well, you've given me the opportunity to boast that I did have a ride in one of those once. It was the one owned by Nick Mason of the Pink Floyd, which he bought for, I think, £30,000.
He did, 30 or 35,
in the 70s,
yes.
and still has.
And hasn't it got 250 GTOs, a number plate?
It certainly has. That's what it is, yeah.
Yeah.
I was given a lift in it up the Goodwood Hill by Jochen Mass, funnily enough. It was all right, yeah. It was only worth a couple of million there.
Why didn't you buy it?
Well, I made
a snip. Anyway, if it's a Formula One car, sorry, I'm going to carry on with your question, because if it's a Formula One car you're talking about, then I'm a bit sad that you didn't buy me the Ferrari 312 T3, the very chassis in which my childhood hero Carlos Reutemann took the pole at Monaco and won the United States Grand Prix at Watkins Glen, both in 1978. It was recently sold as part of the Bernie Ecclestone collection that Mark Mateschitz bought, son of Dietrich Mateschitz of Red Bull fame. Obviously, we don't know what Bernie might have sold it for on its own, because it was part of a 69-car job lot. Maybe $8 million, maybe $6 million, if Bernie was feeling generous, which he rarely is when it comes to doing deals. So why didn't you buy that for me, Richard, actually? It was for sale just before Christmas, after all. It would have made a very nice Christmas present.
Sorry, Matt, Bernie wouldn't take the $6 million. But I'll get you the dinky toy next year.
Well, I'll settle for it.
I'd go for the 1949 Le Mans winning 166mm. Historic, beautiful, two-seater, perfectly good for tootling down the high street. In the 60s, someone bought it for 4,000 Swiss francs, and nowadays it belongs to a collector in Reno, Nevada. And what would it be worth? Maybe, given its history, 50 million quid, possibly. But I don't think the current owner is listening to offers.
4,000 francs, that's probably about 1,000 quid, isn't it, back in the day?
Probably, but not much more. No.
Yeah. Anyway, let's jump back to that time then, or not actually the late 40s, but the early 1950s to be precise. Because by the end of 1951, Enzo Ferrari was running a race-winning Formula One team and a revered sports car program. And things got even better for him in 1952 and 1953, didn't they, Richard? Because Alberto Ascari, son of Antonio Ascari, who, as we discussed in the last episode, was a driver whom Enzo Ferrari used to rub shoulders with and for whom he had enormous admiration, swept all before him in the 1952 and 1953 Formula One seasons. Well, I say Formula One seasons, but to be pernickety, and indeed to deliver an early Anorak fact in this episode, the 1952 and 1953 Formula One seasons were run to Formula 2 rules. So Ascari's Formula One World Championship winning Ferrari 500s were actually Formula 2 cars, not Formula One cars. Anyway, were those 2 years, 1952 and 1953, were they when Ferrari was really put on the map internationally, Richard?
Yes, after the win at Le Mans in 1949, this was the next big step. And what really helped Ferrari was the abrupt change in the regulations for 1952, as you've hinted at just now. Alfa Romeo had won the first two world championships under regulations that specified engines of either 1.5 litres supercharged or 4.5 litres unsupercharged. But Alfa were pulling out at the end of 1951 because they were unwilling to carry on bearing the high costs, and there were hardly any other teams willing to spend what it took to build competitive cars to those rules. So what the governing body did, very sensibly for once, as you say, was to stage the World Championship for Formula 2, where the cars had 2-litre unsupercharged engines. They did that for the next 2 seasons. And immediately the manufacturers who'd been racing successfully in F2, like Maserati and HWM, found themselves competing for the world title. And there was Ferrari, of course. Aurelio Lampredi had designed a simple but powerful 4-cylinder engine, which was fitted into a standard single-seater chassis and called the 500. And to drive it in 1952, the Scuderia had a squad of drivers, including Ascari, who was as talented as anyone of his generation, his friend Luigi Villaresi, Nino Farina, who'd been the 1950 world champion with Alfa, Piero Taruffi, and the young Brit Mike Hawthorne. Taruffi won the first race of the championship series in Switzerland since Ascari was off in America, having a go at the Indy 500 in a Ferrari special, not successfully as it turned out. But when Ascari returned to Europe, there was no stopping him. He won the remaining 6 Grand Prix and then 5 more in 1953 to make him the first man to win back-to-back world titles. And 9 of his wins were 1-2s, which tells you how dominant the Scuderia was.
Absolutely, and a few of them were 1-2-3s. In fact, one of them was a 1-2-3-4. That's Nürburgring 1952, although the guy who finished third, Rudi Fischer, wasn't in a works Ferrari, but in an Écurie Espadon Ferrari, but a Ferrari nonetheless.
I imagine Enzo was particularly delighted that Maserati, the local rivals, who'd been building their own racing car since 1926, 20 years longer than him, won only a single Grand Prix in those 2 seasons, although that was in front of the home crowd at Monza. And actually, that was one of the races that you'd give a lot to have been at. Nearly 3 hours of non-stop slipstreaming that eventually boiled down to a battle between 4 works Ferraris and Fangio's Maserati. And it was settled at the very last corner when Fangio's teammate, Onofre Marimon, who was actually 3 laps down, rammed the tail of Ascari's car, sending them both into a spin, while Farina glanced off Marimon's spinning car but kept going. Fangio got to the line just ahead of Farina's Ferrari, but it was so hectic and exciting that the man with the checkered flag forgot to drop it, and both cars did an extra lap at racing speed, just to make sure, as Dennis Jenkinson put it in his motorsport report.
Absolutely. You'd have thought that, let me think, you'd have thought that after winning 2 consecutive world championships for Ferrari, Alberto Ascari would be safely ensconced at the Scuderia for years to come, wouldn't you? But, that isn't how racing works, then or now. Ask Damon Hill. Ask Damon Hill, for example, who was unceremoniously bundled out of Williams at the end of the 1996 season to make way for Heinz-Harald Frentzen. Got nothing against Heinz-Harald Frentzen, by the way, despite the fact that he, Damon, had just won the 1996 World Championship. So, no, at the end of 1953, Ascari, too, was unceremoniously bundled out of Ferrari. Well, to be fair, I say unceremoniously bundled out, but actually he slung his hook of his own accord, really, didn't he? But only because Ferrari was unwilling to pay him what he reckoned he deserved, the money that he deserved. Who was right, Richard? Was Ascari being greedy or was Ferrari being mean?
Well, Ferrari had delayed an offer to Ascari at the end of 1953, and he didn't actually make the offer until the double world champion told him he and Villoresi had been negotiating with Lancia, who had offered him better terms. All he wanted was for Ferrari to match that money. But Enzo refused, probably feeling that he was being blackmailed.
Very possibly, so I'm sure you're right. But anyway, so Ascari went to Lancia. But when the 1954 Formula One season began, Lancia hadn't managed to get a car ready for him. So he raced 2 Grand Prix for Maserati, Reims and Silverstone, and 1, Monza, for, yes, you guessed it, Ferrari. But he finished none of them. He raced only 1 Grand Prix for Lancia that year, in fact, Pedralbes in Spain, and he didn't finish that one either. It was a terrible year for him, 1954. Although, to be fair, he did win 2 non-championship Formula One races for Lancia in 1954 at the Parco de Valentino circuit in Turin and the Posillipo circuit in Naples. The following year, 1955, was an even more terrible year for Ascari, of course. He raced twice for Lancia, Buenos Aires and Monaco, and he finished neither of those races either. And then 4 days after Monaco, he was killed testing a Ferrari at Monza. Anyway, what about Luigi Villoresi, Richard? He left Ferrari for Lancia with Ascari in 1954, didn't he?
Yeah, Villoresi didn't like Ferrari very much, and with quite good reason. It went back to just before the war, when his elder brother Emilio, known as Mimi, had been killed testing an Alfetta. and Enzo hadn't shown much sympathy. He accused the dead man of having crashed, if you can believe this, because of an attack of indigestion through eating too much pasta, and he refused to sanction an insurance payout until it was proved that the steering had broken.
That's definitely an anorak fact, Richard, and a cruel one, to be fair. Anyway, the end of the 1953 season was also the first time that Ferrari played what became his familiar game of announcing his intention to leave the sport. The rules were changing again to unsupercharged engines of 2.5 litres capacity, and he knew that Mercedes, with their huge resources, were about to make a return, along with Lancia, although we've already discussed the fact that Lancia's 1954 Formula One season was a bit of an anticlimax. But anyway, by threatening to quit when his team was on top, Ferrari probably hoped to win some extra backing, perhaps from the government?
Well, he didn't quit, of course, but he was dead right about Mercedes, who came back midway through the season with Fangio leading the team and immediately re-established the kind of complete dominance they'd enjoyed before the war. And the new Lancia, although it was late, as you've said, and unreliable to begin with, was also faster than the rather ungainly new Ferrari, which was known as the Squallow, the shark, although it looked more like a whale and it handled like one too.
Yes.
Gonzalez actually won a Grand Prix for Ferrari that season at Silverstone, but it was with the new 2.5-litre engine in an old F2 type chassis. And by the time Hawthorn won the last race of the season in the newer car, Ferrari had already decided to junk it, and he didn't seem to have a designer capable of coming up with anything better.
Yeah, and what saved him, strangely enough, was the Lancia team. They weren't properly ready to compete full-time until 1955, as I've said earlier, when Ascari and Villoresi had been joined there by another Italian, Eugenio Castellotti. And they looked to be on the brink of great things when Ascari was killed. And I know I mentioned his death earlier, but it's worth my saying just a little bit more about it now because, well, it was so odd. Why do I say that? Well, because Ascari was killed while he was testing a Ferrari sports car at Monza just a few days after he'd been fished out of the Med at Monte Carlo when he'd gone through the harbour during the Monaco Grand Prix.
It was said, actually, that he turned up at Monza wanting to get into a racing car, just like getting back on the horse after you've had an accident.
Exactly, that's interesting.
And that car was Castellotti's, and Castellotti was going to drive it in the Mille Miglia, and it happened to be there, so Ascari got
and it wasn't a planned test at all.
Not at all.
No. And so, yes, and even then, so not only was it unplanned and therefore strange in that sense, but it was also a strange one because it happened on a deserted track. And it was noted that because he hadn't brought his racing kit, including his famously lucky pale blue helmet, did he borrow Castellotti's
I don't know.
helmet?
It was somebody else's.
It was certainly a friend's, but some people say it was Castellotti's helmet. And instead of race overalls, he was, or what passed for race overalls in 1955, he was just wearing normal civvies, street clothes.
Yeah, there were sort of investigations into the accident, but there was nobody ever came up with an explanation for it. And Ferrari was very upset by his death, quite understandably. And in Luca Del Monte's biography, there are extracts from a very touching exchange of letters between Enzo and Mieta Ascari, the driver's widow. And this is what Mieta wrote: "I wish I could tell you how much Alberto loved and admired you." We know that's pretty extraordinary. Isn't it?
It's lovely.
From the widow of a woman who's just been killed.
Yes.
The car of the man she's writing to. Anyway, if you ever go to the monumental cemetery in Milan, Matt, you'll find Alberto and his father Antonio buried in the same family tomb with beautiful stone busts of the two of them in their helmets at the entrance. And incredibly, Alberto remains the last Italian to win the F1 world title.
That really is an extraordinary statistic, isn't it? 72 years ago. Mm-hmm. Anyway, I've never been to that tomb, and I should go. But anyway, by the time Alberto Ascari died, Lancia were already in terminal financial trouble. And when the government did bail them out, it was decided to hand the racing team over to Enzo Ferrari, including the beautiful cars with their very potent V8 engines, designed by Vittorio Giano, who Ferrari had persuaded to leave Fiat and join Alfa Romeo back in the 1920s. And that was a stroke of good fortune, wasn't it, Richard?
Yeah, it was. And it wasn't the only time Enzo Ferrari was pulled back from the brink of disaster by a combination of luck and opportunism. With a single bound, he was free, or at least he was back at the races. And all he had to do was say thank you, and then junk his old cars and get his engineers to do a bit of work on the car that initially appeared on the official entry lists as the Lancia Ferrari D50. And he also got Castellotti as an extra driver. The other bit of luck was the withdrawal of Mercedes at the end of 1955 after their involvement in the terrible accident at Le Mans that summer when 83 people were killed. And that meant not just the removal of the dominant team in Formula One, but the availability of Fangio, now a triple champion, to join Ferrari, taking the seat that would surely have been occupied by Ascari had he lived.
Yeah.
So the new partnership had a good outcome with Fangio's fourth title, but neither he nor Enzo enjoyed the experience. They didn't warm to each other as people, and Ferrari particularly didn't like the fact that Fangio had a manager who negotiated his salary and bonuses. He was used to dealing directly with the drivers and having them accept what he offered, which was usually no salary, but 50% of whatever they won. 20 years later, he felt a bit the same about another of his champions, the financially shrewd Niki Lauda.
We'll come to that later, but actually Fangio needed a bit of help to win that 1956 World Championship, didn't he, Richard? He won the first race of the season in Argentina, his home race in Argentina, but only after his own car had broken down a quarter of the way into the race, and he jumped into the one being driven by his teammate Luigi Musso. In those days, drivers could share a car and split the championship points. The same thing happened at Monza at the end of the season, when several drivers were in with a chance of the title. Fangio's steering broke at Monza before half distance, and Musso was again asked to hand him his car. He refused this time. There was drama in the pits when Fangio's female companion ran across to Musso's girlfriend and yelled, "You don't treat a champion of the world like that."
What a pity Drive to Survive wasn't around in 1956.
Just so, exactly. Anyway, eventually, the gentlemanly Peter Collins, just 24 years old, whereas Fangio was 45, and Collins was in another of the 5 works Lancia Ferraris, Collins agreed to hand over his car. So together, Fangio and Collins finished second behind Stirling Moss's Maserati, giving Fangio the points he needed for the World Championship. Actually, Collins had been one of those drivers who was in with a shout of the title, and Ferrari recognised his remarkable unselfishness. But can you imagine how, the Formula One Twitterati, or indeed Drive to Survive, would have reacted if Twitter or X or indeed any other social media had existed back then? Or if Charles Leclerc were asked to accord the same favour to Lewis Hamilton later this year?
Well, I think we know what Leclerc's response would be to that.
I think we do.
There was never a chance of Fangio spending a second season at Maranello, particularly after his manager accused the team of sabotaging Fangio's efforts to win a very wet Mille Miglia by drilling holes in the floor of his car that actually let water in rather than out.
Extraordinary little story.
Ferrari admired Fangio's talent, no doubt, but he disliked the fact that his primary loyalty didn't seem to be to the team. Quote from Ferrari, "He placed his self-interest, which was quite legitimate and natural, before the affection which has instead kept other great drivers faithful to certain marks through good and ill fortune." In other words, Fangio thought he was more important than the team, which was not how Ferrari saw things at all. So Fangio went off to join Maserati, to return to Maserati, the local rivals, for his last full season and his 5th title, leaving the Scuderia Ferrari just as Enzo liked it, with a bunch of ambitious young drivers fighting each other to be the team's number 1 in 1957. And when an Italian journalist wrote a book about that bunch of drivers, he titled it Gli Indisciplinati, the Wild Bunch. But they were also the tragic bunch. Let's take them in order. Start with Eugenio Castellotti, killed at the Modena Autodrome after Ferrari had telephoned him one morning in 1957 and got him out of bed in a hotel in Florence where he was staying with his girlfriend, the famous actress Delia Scala. Ferrari had heard that Jean Bérard had broken the lap record at the local track in a Maserati, and he wanted to get it back. Castellotti did as he was told, but ended up with his Ferrari somersaulting into a grandstand, fortunately deserted. It was a test day, but with fatal consequences for the drivers. Then Alfonso de Portago, the Spanish nobleman and Olympic bobsleigh competitor. What happened to him, Matt?
The 11th Marquess of Portago, a Spanish nobleman, born in London, fluent in 4 languages, handsome, and a consummate womanizer. And yes, as you say, Richard, an Olympic bobsleigh driver as well as a racing driver, and a jockey and a pilot too. He rode in 2 Grand Nationals, and he once flew a plane under London's Tower Bridge for a bet, which was very cool and very daring. Actually, very cool and very daring was the perfect description for de Portago, in fact. He was brave and fast, and he was killed, and this is why we're talking about these people, because of the tragedies, the serial tragedies. He was killed aged just 28 at the wheel of a Ferrari sports car when a tyre burst at speed on the Mille Miglia in 1957. Not only was de Portago killed, in fact, but so were his co-driver, Edmund Nelson, and 9 spectators, 5 of whom were kids. Dreadful. A famous photograph, which was captioned "The Kiss of Death," showed de Portago kissing the Hollywood actress Linda Christian at a stop just before his final accident. De Portago's death was, of course, widely reported, and the obituary in the Vatican's official newspaper, L'Osservatore Romano, included the sentence, quote, "Enzo Ferrari is like the Roman god Saturn, devouring his own children," end quote.
There was a big fuss that went on for a long time about that crash. No wonder. It was the 5 children, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
People very upset. And next there was Luigi Musso, who was killed during the French Grand Prix at Reims in 1958, when he left the track at high speed and cartwheeled into a field. His girlfriend, whose name was Fiamma Bresci, later claimed that his British teammates, Collins and Hawthorne, had ganged up on him. Others knew he was burdened by large debts and believed he'd made a mistake because he was trying too hard to win the unusually large sum of prize money on offer, about £10,000, which was a huge sum back then. Fiamma later became Ferrari's mistress. He set her up with a shop in Bologna, and in her account, he kept begging her to marry him, even though he was still married to Laura and bringing up Piero with Lina. But it didn't end happily for Collins or Hawthorne either, did it, Matt?
No, it didn't. Collins was killed at Nürburgring in August 1958, aged just 26, and he died in much the same way as Musso had been killed the previous month. Collins dropped a wheel into a ditch, the car flipped, and it landed upside down. He died of head injuries in a Bonn hospital later that day. We did a podcast about Hawthorne, Hawthorne and Moss, in Colossally Series 2, but suffice it to say now, to recap, he was killed, Hawthorne, aged just 29, when he overdid it in his Jaguar Mark I road car in convoy with the British privateer Formula One entrant Rob Walker's Gullwing Merc. Both of them were driving too fast, racing almost certainly, on the Guildford bypass in Surrey in January 1959, just 3 months after Hawthorne had become Ferrari's first British world champion.
I think all this tragedy in such a short time had a powerful effect on the reputation of Ferrari, and perhaps not quite the one you might expect. There was a kind of dark glamour attached to the name. That might seem a bit distasteful, even sick, but I think it's true, and it's part of human nature. The Pope may have been angry, but the general public accepted that sudden death was a part of motor racing, in which young men took risks. Subconsciously, people got the idea that Ferrari, with its blood-red cars and its warlike emblem of a prancing horse on a shield, was a cause for which bold and usually handsome young men were prepared to risk their lives and sometimes pay the price. What was Ferrari's own view? Well, he'd been doing this a long time, and he'd seen many drivers die at the wheel. He'd been through 2 world wars. He'd lost his father and his brother in traumatic circumstances. And in 1956, he'd suffered the biggest loss of all, that of his beloved son Dino, who was said to be a promising engineer, and who finally died of muscular dystrophy at the age of 26 on the eve of the French Grand Prix, which Collins won. And that was a fitting salute in a way, because Collins had taken a particularly liking to the ailing young Dino, and he spent a lot of time with him in his painful last months, and Ferrari appreciated that too. It also has to be pointed out that not one of the crashes on track we've just described, to Castellotti, de Portago, Musso and Collins, was caused by mechanical failure. Ferraris were strong cars. One of the crashes, de Portago's, was the fault of a burst tyre, but the others were caused by driver error. Ferrari was the common denominator, but he wasn't to blame. Unless, of course, you think that sending out young men to race your cars in itself is reprehensible, as the Vatican obviously did. What do you think Ferrari felt about it all, Matt?
Well, I think Enzo Ferrari kind of went into a permanent state of mourning after his son Dino's death. Obviously, the other deaths affected him, but Dino's much more than any of the others. And Jody Scheckter, who won the Formula One World Championship for Ferrari in 1979, recently told me what a mystical experience it had been for him when he first visited the old man. I mean, Jody didn't use the words mystical experience. What he actually said was dark glasses in a dark office. That's what Jody said. And Jody isn't a wordsmith, and he wouldn't mind me saying that he isn't, but those few words, his words often tell a great story, Jody. And he, Ferrari, stopped ever attending Grand Prix, and he became something of a recluse, therefore, as far as the Formula One community was concerned anyway.
Dark glasses in a dark office, that's great.
It's a great little phrase, isn't it?
That evokes something.
It does. And in 1965, Ferrari wrote a memoir entitled My Terrible Joys. And I think the apparently contradictory juxtaposition, an oxymoron I think it's called, of the words terrible and joys says a lot. Do you own a copy of My Terrible Joys, Richard?
I do, as it happens, Matt. Yeah,
do you?
I do.
I wish I did. I had a look quite recently on Amazon the other day, and I found one for sale. 898 quid. I didn't buy it.
I had a look yesterday. There's a first edition on sale, signed by Enzo in his violet
Good job
ink
I'm sitting down.
for 2,400 and something quid. So
Wow.
there you go. It's worth it.
Yeah.
Ferrari had gone into mourning for Dino, as you say, and in a sense he never came out. He still had another son, of course, Piero, the younger boy, who was growing up out of the public eye with his mother, using her surname, Lardi, to keep the relationship secret. Piero Lardi had just turned 9 when Dino died, and although Piero saw his father most days when he visited Lina, he never met his brother.
He never did, and that feels like a good time for a break. Before we go on, if you were with us for our last episode, you'd know that for this season of Colossally, we're doing something special for those of you in the Race Members Club. As I mentioned last time, the Race Members Club is the place to enjoy ad-free versions of this podcast and all of the other podcasts in the Races stable, and the monthly cost is about the same as a cup of coffee. Very cheap. Anyway, those of you in the Members Club will have access to a special Q&A episode at the end of Season 3, and we'll also be answering a handful of your questions about each topic at the end of all the shows, starting from next week.
That's right. So if you want to submit a question about Enzo Ferrari for us to answer at the end of next week's episode, head to patreon.com/therace and sign up to the Members Club. There's also a direct link in the description to this episode.
So, back to the show and back to the 1950s. And if the 1950s were a bit of a roller coaster for Enzo Ferrari, then the 1960s provided almost as many ups and downs. At this point, in the early 1960s, Ferrari was under real pressure in Formula One from what he called, in slightly derogatory term, the garagiste teams. The garagiste were the smaller independent British teams such as Cooper, Lotus, which operated out of small garages and workshops and had used ingenuity rather than money or manpower to fight and often beat the established manufacturer teams such as Ferrari. In 1959, Tony Brooks, in his front-engined Ferrari, had lost the World Championship in the final round of the season to Jack Brabham, who was driving a less powerful but more nimble rear-engined Cooper, garagiste car. And that was a blow to Enzo Ferrari. He'd always maintained that the ox should pull the cart, not push it. In other words, the engine should always be in front of the driver. Ferrari did eventually make a successful shift to rear-engine cars or mid-engine cars because he had no choice. He had no choice at all. But when he finally and perhaps reluctantly did that, he was following a trend rather than innovating. So, Richard, was there a slight irony in Enzo Ferrari's sniffiness towards those garagiste teams, particularly given that he had been the independent upstart not that long before? And do you think Enzo's stubbornness prevented his own team from innovating, or at least delayed its innovation?
I think he called them garagistes because they didn't build their own engines, and to him the heart of a racing car was the engine. If you didn't build your own engine, as he or Alfa or Maserati or Mercedes had done, you couldn't call yourself a proper manufacturer. But he had two major flaws as a team owner, and they both contributed to the fluctuating fortunes, the heights of triumph and humiliation, that made the Scuderia into the sport's most compelling soap opera. One was his liking for encouraging what's politely known as creative tension among his sporting directors and drivers, which reached an early peak in 1959 when his driver Jean Bérard got the sack after punching the team manager Romolo Tavoni, who'd accused him of overstressing his engine on purpose.
In a restaurant in Reims, was it
I believe
not?
So, yes.
Yes.
In front of witnesses.
Yes.
We'll come back to that sort of thing. The other flaw was Ferrari's conservative approach to technology, not necessarily a useful attribute for someone in a sport that's supposed to exist on innovation.
Hardly.
Well, for a long time, he believed that as long as the engine was good, the rest of the car could more or less take care of itself. So Ferrari's engines, whether they were straight fours, V6s, V8s, V12s, or eventually flat 12s, were seldom beaten for power. But he was very slow onto things like disc brakes. But you're right, as he believed that the engine belonged in front of the driver, simply because that's where it had always been. And that attitude meant that during his lifetime, even when the cars were at their most successful, they generally didn't lead the way technically. And it's kind of symbolic that Mike Hawthorn took the very last driver's title to be won in a front-engine car in a Ferrari in 1958. And Tony Brooks took the last Grand Prix win for a front-engine car, also in a Ferrari, at Alvas the following year. By then, the little rear-engine Coopers were even winning at Monza on Ferrari's home ground. The rest of the world had moved on, and it took Ferrari a while to catch up, didn't it, Matt?
It did indeed, but in 1961, he well and truly did catch up, because his dinky little Ferrari 156 Sharknose, designed by Carlo Chiti, in which Phil Hill won the 1961 World Championship, was a rear-engined or mid-engined car. And had Hill's teammate Wolfgang von Trips not been killed in one of the cars at Monza, he might well have been world champion instead. The two of them completely dominated the 1961 Formula One season in that beautiful little car, winning 5 of the 8 Grand Prix. By rights, therefore, Ferrari, they should have built on that 1961 success, shouldn't they? But as things turned out, 1962 turned out to be a terrible year for the Scuderia, dominated, as it was, instead, by the garagiste. Ferrari and Chiti fell out, and Chiti and a few of the others, including the key engineer Giotto Bizzarini, left. Ferrari won no Grand Prix at all. They were all won by BRM, their driver Graham Hill became world champion, Cooper, Lotus and Porsche.
One of the things the rebels had been upset about was Laura Ferrari's recently acquired habit of attending the races and putting her oar in, checking their expenses and so on, and querying things. Enzo put a stop to that interference, but it was too late to stop the exodus. The one constructive outcome of the revolt was Ferrari's choice of Mauro Forghieri as Chiti's replacement. The new technical head of the racing team was only 27, but he was completely steeped in the world of Ferrari. His dad had been a metal worker in the factory. Young Mauro had studied mechanical engineering at Bologna University, and he was a brilliant designer. It's often said, in fact, that he was the last man to have been capable of designing every element of a racing car, the chassis and the engine and all the other bits, if necessary. And that's old school. I mean, nobody'd ask Adrian Newey, brilliant as he is, to design an engine, would they?
Certainly not. Although, if he turned his hand to it, you never know.
I suppose you never know, yeah, with his pencil and his drawing board, you never know. And in 1963, when success in sports car racing was making up for a dismal Grand Prix drought for Ferrari, Forghieri's 250p became the first rear-engined, or mid-engined if you prefer, car to win at Le Mans. The following year, he produced the single-seater 158, the car that restored the Scuderia's F1 fortunes and took John Surtees to the World Championship, first with an 8-cylinder engine and then as the 1512 with Forghieri's new flat 12. John Surtees had fitted in very well to begin with at Maranello because of his years of winning motorbike championships with MV Agusta. That had got him used to the way Italian teams worked. He and his wife went to dinner with Enzo and Laura Ferrari, and sometimes with Enzo and Lina, and occasionally they'd spend a free weekend at Ferrari's villa near Rimini on the coast. But Surtees thought of himself as a bit of an engineer, and that was where the trouble began. Ferrari made use of him as a test driver, shaking down the latest sports car. Surtees told me that sometimes he'd get frustrated when the cars he'd shaken down were given to customer teams, like Maranello Concessionaires, the British team, or Luigi Canetti's North American racing team. And Surtees would find himself turning up at a race meeting to be given a brand new car that there hadn't been time to test. Unusually, Ferrari had also given Surtees permission to undertake some extracurricular work with his friend Eric Broadley of Lola Cars on developing a new sports car for the Can-Am series in America. Ferrari wasn't pleased when Surtees injured himself in an accident in the Lola, and then Forghieri accused him of stealing the ideas he'd seen in the racing department at Maranello and passing them on to Broadley. This was the legendary Ferrari internal politics at their very worst and most intense.
Yeah, absolutely.
And there was also a feud with Mike Parks, an Englishman who'd been hired as an engineer, but had also won a place in the squad of drivers. He was a very good driver.
He also designed the Hillman Imp, or had a hand in it.
He did. From the Hillman Imp to the Lancia Stratos eventually.
I know.
And then Surtees had a bust-up at Le Mans with Eugenio Dragoni, the team manager, after which Surtees was dismissed. And a week earlier, he'd brought off an epic Grand Prix win for the Scuderia in the wet at Spa. So his dismissal was a very good example of Ferrari's occasional penchant for self-inflicted injuries.
I always remember Surtees, his, I don't know why I've just come to mind, his idiosyncratic pronunciation of the word chassis. Chassis.
Chassis. Well, why not? It's got an S at the end.
Yeah,
why not?
Yeah.
Practical man. So all this was the downside of the creative tension the old man liked to encourage and provoke, and it was exacerbated by his refusal to attend the race meetings, meaning, as we've said before, that he always depended on whatever his sporting director or his spies told him in their phone calls on a Sunday night. When I talked to Surtees about it, he remembered that there had been a lot going on in the background at the time. There was a lot of financial pressure on the company as a whole, and Ferrari had been listening to an offer from the Ford Motor Company in America. Eventually, he rejected it. If you've seen the film Ford versus Ferrari, otherwise known as Le Mans 66, you'll know why. And he decided to resolve the problem by selling half the company to a known quantity, his old friend Gianni Agnelli at Fiat. Surtees made it very clear to me that he still carried a lot of regret about how the relationship ended. Sad to this day were his words. Was sacking him ever likely to have been a good idea, Matt?
Well, in a word, no. But, in a few more words, Surtees, by the way, legend, world champion on 2 wheels and 4, and the only person ever to do that, and probably the only person ever.
Mystifyingly never knighted for that amazing achievement.
Never, and he should have been. Mm-hmm. Anyway, he was, with all that, he was a bit of a curmudgeon. The drivers he later ran in his own Surtees Formula One team often said that. Most of them said that. And Ferrari said of him, quote, "I know what I'm losing. What I don't know is how much I'd be losing if I kept him on."
That's brilliant.
End quote. It's a great quote. Anyway, the upshot was that after Surtees' departure, Ferrari entered a long, barren spell that lasted until things perked up in a big way in 1974. So the best part of a decade, really. Certainly, 8 years, including defeat by Ford at Le Mans in 1966. And don't forget, at Le Mans, Ferrari had won 6 times in a row before that, between 1960 and 1965. Then there was Lorenzo Bandini's horrible fiery death at Monaco in 1967. Then there were false dawns with, good drivers, great drivers like Jackie Ickx, Mario Andretti. And, the 312B in the early 1970s. It was a good car. And the regulation, bad luck, inability of Chris Amon in that car ever to win a Grand Prix despite his brilliance, etc., etc., etc.
Yep, both Ickx and Amon could well have become world champions.
Totally.
With Ferrari.
Yes.
There we are. I think I witnessed the Ferrari F1 team at its very lowest point, actually the lowest point in its history, at Silverstone in 1973. They'd only sent 1 car to the British Grand Prix, and that was for Ickx, who was already totally disgusted and demotivated by what was going on. Mauro Forghieri had been shifted across to the experimental department, and Ickx's car was designed by a new man, Sandro Colombo, with Ferrari's first monocoque chassis fabricated in England, which was itself a bit of a heresy. The car was a horrible thing to look at and obviously to drive too, because Ickx qualified 19th on a 26-car grid. And after 9 cars had been eliminated by that very famous first-lap crash.
Jody Scheckter again,
yeah. He finished a very undistinguished 8th, Jackie Ickx, behind 2 McLarens, a Lotus, a March, a Tyrrell and a Brabham, Enzo Ferrari's much-despised English garagistes, and a BRM. And that wasn't where a Ferrari belonged. It was such a bad weekend that Ickx walked away and the team missed the next 2 races entirely. This was now Italy's national team. It was followed by an army of absolutely devoted tifosi fans, keen to read about the red car's triumphs in their copies of the Gazzetta dello Sport. So it was a betrayal of everything the team were thought to stand for. Although, of course, betrayals and disasters had all become part of the mythology of Ferrari. So from there, the only way was up, wasn't it, Matt?
Yes, and the answer was supplied by 2 men, Mauro Forghieri and Niki Lauda. They didn't win either World Championship in 1974. McLaren won the Constructors' World Championship and their driver Emerson Fittipaldi won the Drivers' World Championship. But Lauda and Forghieri's Ferrari 312B3 amounted to the fastest driver-car combo of the 1974 season. And although Niki won only 2 Grand Prix that year, he took 9 pole positions, which is a telling stat. Lauda was a no-bullshit guy at Ferrari right from the start, and the first, really, to approach it that way. And that's what they needed, because previous drivers hadn't really had the balls to tell the old man the truth about his team's shortcomings. Do you know what? I feel a quick impersonation coming on, Richard, if I may.
Oh, please.
Well, if you were to ask Niki Lauda the question, what was wrong with the Ferrari Formula One car when you first tested it? He might have replied, "It's very simple. The Ferrari was a shitbox like you can't believe."
A lot of people had said that kind of thing over the years, but no driver before Niki had ever said it to Ferrari's face. Actually, there's a third person that we missed out in this description of the Ferrari Renaissance in 74, 75, and that's Luca di Montezemolo.
True.
The very young team manager, an ex-rally navigator who was brought in. He was a kind of protege of Fiat's Gianni Agnelli, and he was brought in to manage the team, and he really shook it up, and he listened to Niki, and he didn't give Ferrari bullshit either.
Yes, you're right to name check him at that
Luca
point.
was really important. And anyway, and it did the trick.
Exactly. It really did do the trick. And that was 1974, but in 1975, the Ferrari, was a good car, a very, very good car. It was the class of the field, in fact, and reliable now, too. And Lauda duly won the Drivers' World Championship easily, and Ferrari the Constructors. And they started the next season, 1976, just as dominantly. But then something rather extraordinary happened, didn't it, Richard?
Yes, because being Ferrari, this Renaissance, or Risorgimento, if you want the Italian version, was immediately followed by more drama. In this case, the season in which Lauda went head-to-head with James Hunt, the new British hero in his McLaren. And the first real flashpoint came at Brands Hatch, where the British crowd almost erupted onto the track in support of Hunt. Do you remember the crash at the start, Matt, between the McLaren and the two Ferraris?
Well, I certainly do, and I was there, aged 13, one of thousands of fans slow hand-clapping and booing the officials and demanding... Were you there, by the way?
I wasn't.
You
no,
weren't.
No.
But booing and slow hand-clapping them and demanding that they allow Hunt to restart the race, which at that point they were minded not to do, because he'd taken a shortcut back to the pits after the lap 1 shunt that had halted the whole race, rather than completing the whole lap. The officials relented. I mean, people power, you could call it. It really was a lot of...
Were you booing and cheering?
I was booing. I was slow hand-clapping.
Were you throwing your Fanta can or whatever?
Well, I don't know if I could stretch to a Fanta can. I was only 13. But I was certainly slow hand-clapping and booing and doing all of that. But everybody was. It was quite a... beginning to become a quite, I wouldn't say ugly, but certainly antagonistic.
I remember watching it on the telly, even at home.
It was a bit like a football crowd.
Very much.
It was, anti-referee type sentiment.
Yep.
Anyway, the organisers perhaps wisely relented. People power. We got our wish. And Hunt raced and won. And we went home happy. Actually, to be fair to James, he won brilliantly. He really did well. Beat Lauda, but he lost the race in an FIA court in Paris a couple of months later. Maybe one day we'll do a podcast on the FIA, but this is not it. Anyway, then Lauda almost died in the very next race at Nürburgring, and he fought for his life, a battle he won. Then he returned to the cockpit just 6 weeks after having been given the last rites by a priest in a German hospital, and after Reutemann had been signed as his replacement because Enzo Ferrari thought he wasn't going to make it.
And he'd given you a call and you said Reutemann's.
I said, Enzo Ferrari had seen me booing and hand clapping, so he said, this boy knows something. Anyway, then, of course, Hunt won the World Championship, 1976 World Championship, in a torrential downpour in Japan at the end of the year.
Yes, well, that race in Fuji, of course, it began in a violent rainstorm. And Lauda, whose eyes had been damaged, his ability to blink had been damaged by his crash at the Nürburgring. He started the race in this storm, and he got out after a couple of laps, pulled in, got out of the car and said, that's it, and therefore handed the World Championship to Hunt, who didn't even need to win the race to win the title.
And by the way, that was the story that grabbed the headlines, but actually I think Emerson Fittipaldi also parked up. He said it was too wet. Yeah. So the two most successful drivers in the field, because Emo was a double world champion already, said, no, too dangerous.
Yeah. And of course, Ferrari wasn't very happy about it because he'd lost a world championship. And Lauda remembered what Enzo had said to him during a very short post-race conversation on the phone from the airport on the way home. Or more importantly, he remembered what Ferrari didn't say. Do you want to go on driving? What's wrong? What can I do? What's our next move? These were some of the questions he never asked.
Significant.
Yeah, very significant, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think the fact that Luca de Montezemolo is no longer running the team had a lot to do with it. He'd moved elsewhere within the Fiat empire after winning the title in 75. And Daniele Audetto, his replacement, wasn't up to it. Lauda had a contract for the next season, and he stayed on out of sheer cussedness. He knew that Ferrari had lost faith in him and that Reutemann would be given priority in pre-season testing and so on. And he had something to prove, and that's really why he stayed. I know Carlos is your particular hero, Matt, so I thought I'd tell you what Brenda Werner, Ferrari's English secretary during that era, told me about him. Quote, "The first time he walked into the office, I nearly died. So handsome. Those blue eyes, that tan. I nearly fell off my chair. Such a charming guy. But he lived in a world of his own. Never knew what day it was." But he made a decent start to the 1977 season, didn't he, Matt?
He did. Well, look, and who am I to contradict Enzo Ferrari's secretary? But you're right, Richard. Reutemann started 1977 brilliantly, comprehensively outdriving Lauda in Argentina, obviously Reutemann's home Grand Prix, where he, Reutemann, finished third, and Brazil, where he, Reutemann, won. Nicky wasn't going to put up with that, and he went to Fiorano and he tested the car a lot in the run-up to the next Grand Prix, Kyalami, which he duly won. Perhaps, maybe I'll do another impersonation, perhaps he said to Ferrari something like this: "It's very simple. Reutemann is full of bullshit like you can't believe."
Bravo.
You've noticed the similarities in my... But it's always it's very simple, and then the next statement, which ends with "you can't believe."
And a bit of bullshit in it.
That's shit or bullshit or something like that. Anyway, enough impersonations. Lauda turned the tables on Reutemann. He won 2 more Grand Prix in 1977 to make it 3 in all, while Reutemann won no more that year, just the one he'd won in Brazil. And Lauda left the team early with his second World Championship won. And off he went with his favourite mechanic, Ermanno Cuoghi, to Brabham. A big V sign to Ferrari.
And Brenda Werner, the secretary, said his last words to Enzo Ferrari were, "Ciao, Enzo." I won't do the impersonation. That made him the only driver in the history of Ferrari ever to presume to address the old man by his first name.
What an extraordinary, summation of Nicky's brass neck, really.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And Reutemann didn't last much longer there, did he? Ferrari's verdict on him was that, quote, "he was apt to let his emotions lose him races that he'd been slated to win," unquote, and there was no greater crime in the old man's eyes. And he was soon being overshadowed, in a sense, in the team by the arrival of his supposed number 2, a French-Canadian named Gilles Villeneuve, who looked about 17 but was actually 27, and was soon reminding Enzo of Tazio Nuvolari, the driver he loved above all others. What qualities do you think he saw in them both, Matt?
Well, before I get into that, to be fair, Reutemann won 4 Grand Prix for Ferrari in 1978, while Villeneuve won only 1. So I think overshadowed is incorrect, I have to say. In fact, I think 1978 was probably Reutemann's best year in Formula One.
Fair point. Well made.
But don't get me wrong, like Nuvolari, Villeneuve was a great driver, but also a genius. And that's what made Enzo Ferrari love them both so much.
And 1978 was when Laura Ferrari died, aged 77, after being bedridden for several years. And that was when the disease that had killed her son caught up with her too. Her husband's memories of her were mixed, shall we say, to say the least. Quote, "Her daily criticism of my smallest decisions caused irritating arguments," unquote, he remembered.
Deary me.
I've actually seen the inscribed first edition of his memoir, My Terrible Joys, that you mentioned earlier, the copy that he presented to her in 1963 when it was published. It doesn't say, "To my darling wife" on the flyleaf, or "To dearest BB," which was his pet name for her when they were courting. All it says, in his famous violet ink, is, "To the mother of Dino." That says quite a lot, doesn't it?
It does say a lot. Obviously, it absolutely bespeaks his enormous devotion to his son, but also it's not a romantic thing to write.
It's not. No. Anyway, what her death meant was that his other son, now in his early 30s, could be publicly acknowledged and at last allowed to go by the name Piero Ferrari. And eventually he and his mother, Lina Lardi, could move into the huge house on the Lago Garibaldi in Modena that Ferrari had bought for himself and Laura. But back to Reutemann just for a minute. When he left Ferrari, he had an interesting description of the experience of dealing with the old man. Quote, "He was like a prime minister surrounded by advisors," he said. "I always had the feeling that several people had spoken to him before our meetings and that several more would speak to him afterwards. Unfortunately, I never got the impression that he believed what I was telling him." Sounds like a scene from Conclave, doesn't it, Matt?
It does.
The Pope of the North surrounded by scheming cardinals and whispering consiglieri. Was Carlos stitched up, just like Surtees?
Well, perhaps. I don't know for sure, but perhaps. But what I do know is that Reutemann had been spooked in 1978 by the almost miraculous pace of the ground effect Lotus 79, in which Andretti had glided his way to the 1978 World Championship. And when Andretti's 1978 Lotus teammate Ronnie Peterson agreed to join McLaren for 1979, Carlos had been quick to bag himself that vacant Lotus seat alongside Andretti. Probably Ferrari may have got wind of, Reutemann getting excited about the Lotus opportunity, and he wouldn't have taken kindly to that. Reutemann started the 1979 season very well, actually, serially outdriving Andretti, but then the other teams perfected ground effect. Ligier, Brabham, Williams, Renault, and Lotus were left behind.
Along with Ferrari.
And also Ferrari.
Yeah. There's something else that Brenda Werner told me. When things started to go bad in 1980, Enzo got Scheckter and Villeneuve each to write him a telex after every race, telling him precisely what the problems had been, and that was unprecedented. And here's her conclusion, quote, "I think he realised that someone wasn't telling him the real truth." Villeneuve should have been the Scuderia's next world champion, shouldn't he, Matt? He won a couple of races in 1981, despite the deficiencies of Ferrari's first turbo-engined F1 car, with a new teammate, the Frenchman Didier Pironi. But although the car was better in 1982, thanks to the arrival of a British designer, Harvey Postlethwaite, who'd been working at Hesketh, it was a season in which tragedy struck the Scuderia again.
Well, absolutely, yes. Terrible season, 1982, from that point of view. Pironi was a very good driver, but Villeneuve was a great driver. And yes, had Villeneuve not been killed at Zolder in 1982, he'd have been world champion for Ferrari that year. I think we can say that pretty safely. And then, had Pironi not injured himself so badly at Hockenheim soon afterwards, he'd have been world champion that year. But as things were, because one of the drivers was killed and the other was so badly injured that he never raced in Formula One again, Ferrari didn't win the 1982 World Championship or the Drivers' Championship. Keke Rosberg won that World Championship for Williams.
Having won one race in the season, I think.
That's right.
Yeah.
The Swiss Grand Prix, which was in France, Dijon.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, yes, Villeneuve was a wonderful driver, able to conjure victory out of Formula One cars that shouldn't really have been able to win anything. Spain 1981, extraordinary win. And the old man loved him for it.
Yep. So once again, as with that group of 1950s drivers we talked about earlier, and Lorenzo Bandini in 1967, a driver had been killed in a Ferrari when it wasn't actually the car's fault. And this time the death really affected Ferrari. You only have to look at the famous photo of them sitting together at Imola when Enzo unusually had gone to watch Villeneuve testing. And they're laughing their heads off, something between them, something that's amused them both. And you see there what effect Villeneuve had on Ferrari. I mean, how many photographs have you seen of Enzo laughing? It was a side he normally kept well hidden for the sake of his image. But with Gilles, he let the facade drop.
Absolutely. And it is a beautiful photograph. It's not, to quote Jodie Scheckter, it's not dark glasses in a dark room, is it?
It isn't.
And that sounds like the cue for our final ad break. So we're into the final part of our podcast now, and indeed into the final part of Enzo Ferrari's life story. In 1981, Enzo Ferrari, now in his 80s, had moved his office from Maranello to Fiorano. Maranello, where the road car business functioned, operated under the watchful eye of Fiat, whereas Fiorano, Ferrari's test track, which was opened in 1972, was all about the race team, which was the part of the business that Enzo really cared about. Luca Dal Monte, Ferrari's most recent biographer, says that Enzo Ferrari dreamed of operating the race team with more independence from Fiat, as Scuderia Ferrari had once operated as an extension from Alfa Romeo, but Fiat was never going to allow that to happen. Was Enzo's world smaller, in a sense, than ever at that point, therefore, Richard?
Well, in a sense, yes. But he was certainly still the dominant figure within it. And it's very important to remember that Bernie Ecclestone and Max Mosley always recognised his significance to F1, his personal significance, even when they were on opposite sides in the long, interminable FISA-FOCA dispute between the governing body and the British teams. I think they liked having an opponent who could be as much of a trickster as they were.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Bernie always referred to him, still does, as Mr. Ferrari and treated him with the utmost respect. He saw it as a father and son relationship, I think, but I wonder if Enzo saw it the same way. Anyway, Bernie knew that in the end, an F1 without Ferrari wouldn't be worth much. Enzo certainly didn't lose his taste for drama as he got older. He claimed rather plaintively and unconvincingly that he never enjoyed success. "I don't experience euphoria," he said. "When I win a Grand Prix, I ask, now what will happen to me? In life, you pay for everything. Success has always come to me at a high price." He had some good cars and drivers in the 80s, didn't he, Matt?
Well, he did. I guess so, yes, he did. But really, with respect to them, no great ones, no truly great ones. After Villeneuve's death. He had Patrick Tombe, he had René Arnoux, he had Michele Alboreto, he had Gerhard Berger. They all won Grand Prix for him, but they never really got that close to winning world championships. That wasn't always their fault, of course, because the Ferrari Formula One cars of the 80s kind of reverted to type in the sense that their engines tended to be powerful, but their chassis tended to be clumsy.
Yeah, lacked a bit of finesse, the kind of finesse that the British manufacturers, the British teams had.
Do you remember Villeneuve calling one of them a big red Cadillac?
Yeah, from that era, I remember I got a sense of a different side of Enzo Ferrari when Gerhard Berger told me about his experiences driving for the team. He said 1987, when he salvaged an otherwise barren season for the team by winning the last two races of the year, he said that was his happiest year in racing. And it wasn't really anything to do with the cars or the races. It was to do with his relationship with the old man. He'd go to Maranello after a race to do a bit of testing in the days when you could test all the time. And Ferrari had their own test track. And Ferrari would take him to lunch in his private room at the Cavallino, the famous restaurant opposite the factory gates. They'd talk about the car for a bit, but then the conversation would turn to a subject that interested Ferrari quite a lot more at that point, and that was girls. And it was a subject on which Gerhard was one of the paddock's experts, as you may remember.
I do indeed remember his expertise.
And Berger said to me, "I was so young and free in my mind that I didn't even know I was happy." Isn't that how we like to imagine the life of a Ferrari driver?
It is, yes. It's a great quote, actually. But yes, going back to Enzo Ferrari, there was no doubt that he was beginning to lose his grip on the company, or to some extent. In 1986, he sanctioned the arrival of John Barnard, another British designer, who, of course, was fresh from great success with McLaren. And Ferrari allowed him to work remotely from something called the Guildford Technical Office, or GTO, an obvious reference to Ferrari's glorious past. But it was an unworkable idea, despite Barnard's creation of the paddle-operated semi-automatic gearshift, which was a real innovation that subsequently became universal. But generally, the Guildford Technical Office made the usual Ferrari internal rivalries that much worse. Michele Alboreto described the process involved in communicating between Guildford and Maranello while developing the car as, quote, like trying to do brain surgery down the telephone, end quote, which I think is an absolutely brilliant quote. Absolutely brilliant quote. Anyway, Harvey Postlethwaite, who'd settled nicely into the working and cultural life at Maranello, was thoroughly alienated by it, and so was Forghieri, who finally left the company.
Still, there were celebrations in 1988 when the old man turned 90. Although his health was failing fast and he was starting to undergo kidney dialysis, they had a grand birthday lunch for him at the factory, with invitations going to 1,800 workers and friends. No local dignitaries, no Fiat bigwigs, no politicians. Ferrari sat at a table for 6 or 7, and so did everybody else.
Right.
And then, a few months later, the Pope came to visit. Most people go to the Vatican to see the Pope, but the Pope went to Maranello to see the Pope of the North.
Yeah, Enzo Ferrari granted the Pope an audience.
Well, almost.
Yes.
He was now confined to his bed at the house in Modena, so they could only speak on the phone. Actually, Ferrari said to him, Reverend Father, I've never been a good Catholic. I've never prayed, but every night when I go to bed, I think of the people who are dear to me. And I know you've recently survived an assassination attempt, which he had, John Paul II.
The Polish Pope.
The Pope,
Yeah.
And now I will add you to my thoughts every night. And then Piero Ferrari took the pontiff for a lap of Fiorano in a Ferrari Mondial.
How about that?
Yep. And so had actually been baptized as a Catholic, but there'd never been any obvious sign of devotion to the faith. And of course, he'd been at war with the Vatican when drivers were killed in his cars. But he was always very friendly with the local priests. And I used to love seeing a man called Don Sergio Mantovani, the parish priest of the church in Modena, where Ferrari had been baptized, all those years before. Don Sergio used to hang around the Scuderia's garage at Monza or Imola. And it was through him that Ferrari funneled, for instance, an anonymous monthly stipend to the widow of one of his test drivers who'd been killed in a road accident in the 50s. That was the kind of generous gesture, like the donation of an MRI scanner, very expensive thing, to the hospital where his son Dino had been treated, that he took reasonable care to keep hidden.
Yeah, it's interesting. Go on.
And when Ferrari himself died at 6 o'clock in the morning of Sunday, August the 14th, 1988, the Ferragosto holiday weekend, it was Don Sergio who supervised the funeral, which took place before the world had been told the news. Piero Ferrari and his wife, Franco Gozzi, his consigliere, his old friend Sergio Scaglietti, the coach builder, his accountant, Carlo Benzi, who knew the secrets of his Swiss bank accounts, and his chauffeur, Dino Tagliazucchi, a former policeman, they were the only ones present to see him interred in the family tomb in Modena, alongside his father and his mother and his wife and his first son. And by 7 in the morning, an hour after he was declared dead, it was all over, and the world could be given the news that one of the greatest names in motorsport, maybe the greatest, had gone. A month later, all the grandees and dignitaries came out for a memorial mass in Modena's beautiful cathedral. Have you been there, Matt? Highly recommend it.
I haven't.
Wonderful building. They were led by Gianni Agnelli, the Fiat president. Agnelli had bailed Ferrari out in the 60s, and he'd now be increasing Fiat's share of Ferrari from 50 to 90%, as they'd agreed would happen on Enzo's death, and Piero hung on to the remaining 10%. There was actually a Grand Prix that weekend, wasn't there, Matt?
There was. At Monza, of all places, and the tifosi went absolutely wild when, just 2 days after Enzo Ferrari's memorial service, Ayrton Senna ran his McLaren into Jean-Louis Schlesser's Williams at the first chicane, letting Berger and Alboreto through to deliver an unforgettable Ferrari 1-2. I mean, McLaren won 15 of the 16 Grand Prix that year, but Ferrari won Enzo Ferrari's home Grand Prix, Monza, just days after the old man's memorial service. No race result has ever been more fitting.
Indeed. It was almost as if Ayrton Senna hadn't been in the race at all, wasn't it?
Well,
just the two Ferraris.
Exactly. And removed by Williams as well.
Yep.
Yeah.
Mauro Forghieri once said that the problem at Ferrari is that Ferrari is a theatre. Well, that's certainly a problem if all you want to do is win races and championships. But the sense of theatre, and it's halfway between grand opera and soap opera, is what makes...
That's very well put, Richard.
Thank you. Is what makes the legend of Ferrari unique in the sport, and no less so today than in any of the eras we've been talking about all the way back to the 20s. You know, we've seen Lewis Hamilton make a big switch before, going from one historic team to another when he went from McLaren to Mercedes in 2013, but with nothing like the attention he's been getting since his move to Ferrari. You know, he was on the cover of Time magazine last week.
Yeah.
Will Lewis's move work? You know, move to Ferrari? It's a question that was asked about Nuvolari, Fangio, Lauda, Mansell, Prost, Vettel, Alonso, and many others. That's the theatre of Ferrari. And Matt, you've spent more time in the modern F1 paddock than I have. Is the spirit of Enzo Ferrari still some sort of a presence there, getting on for 40 years after his death?
Do you know what? I think it is. They may not say it, the current Ferrari team, but I think it is. You know, the red cars, Rosso Corsa, the prancing horse, all that. And you feel it most at Imola and especially Monza. You know, where the passion of the tifosi is something you're aware of all the time when you're there. And if I may say, you feel the ghosts of Italian heroes at Monza somehow. Somehow you do. If you drive into the circuit, the Monza circuit, early in the morning, as I always used to, shortly after dawn, and you enter via the Parco di Monza golf club entrance, and you park your hire car on the old banking, usually a tiny Fiat or even a tiny Lancia. Then you walk in over dewy grass, because it's early September, the beginning of autumn.
Sometimes a bit of mist in the air.
Bit of mist.
Yep.
Bit of mist. And the wind begins to rustle the leaves in the trees, or what remains of the leaves in the trees in early autumn. Well, yes, I sometimes used to fancy I could hear the whispering of the ghosts of Enzo Ferrari and Alberto Ascari. Allow me my lyrical moment, Richard, please.
That's what you're here for, Matt. And that feels like a good place to say, and Colossally, that's history. And to wrap up our doubleheader on Enzo Ferrari, a figure from history without whom motor racing would be very different today. We really hope you've enjoyed the pair of episodes with which we've started Season 3 of the podcast. We love telling these stories.
Yes, we absolutely do, and we absolutely have. And remember, next week we'll answer the first of your questions about our 2 Enzo Ferrari episodes. So if you're not part of the Race Members Club, sign up now so that you can submit your question.
As ever, we'd love to hear your thoughts, whether that's a review on Apple Podcasts, a comment on Spotify, a message on social media, or a good old-fashioned email.
Yes, and you can get in touch via podcasts@the-race.com or drop us a line via social media. I'm at the Bish F1 and Richard is at R Williams 1947.
So that's it for this week. Until next time, with thanks to our producer, the Pope of the West, Johnny Reynolds, and to you for listening.
Thank you, Pope. He's trying not to laugh. He's failing. Carry on.
It's ciao from me.
And it's arrivederci from him.
And colossally, that's history.
The Athletic.